and didn't want anybody else having it until the Metacenter had it first. So here's, in everything I just explained to you about the Moor, the Mason, and the alien factor, this is what it gets into, this esoteric concept of flesh and bone versus wood and stone, this conceptual esoteric perspective. And the idea of the consumer slave versus the master investor, or transcending into the master investor. Flesh and bone is that investment in the Temple of Solomon, the temple being that esoteric reference to the human body. Solomon breaking down into Sol-Oman, which is actually three words in one. Sol being sun, Om meaning frequency, sound, On being Sanskrit for spirit. So the word means the frequency and the sound of light that awakens the beast into the temple. And of course, what is the beast? The human being, the primate beast. It's a reference to the sun-kissed people of Earth, an investment in the lamp of illumination, which is a Moor symbolism, and the legions of light. You'll notice that this is how the title for the prelude came into existence, Legions of Light, Armies of Darkness. And then there is wood and stone, which is an investment in the white Freemasonry, the pale-skinned abomination. Yes, I did just say that. The iron hand of oppression and the armies of darkness. The iron hand oppression stands in opposition to the lamp of illumination, or the Christ energy. Because once again, like I mentioned earlier, Vatican City versus the Egyptian university system. Vatican City was about the iron hand of oppression, and we'll find out later on why that is. And then the Egyptian university system was about the lamp of illumination and disseminating information and knowledge freely for those who could show they could handle it, which gets into later on why there was such friction between the Greeks and the Egyptians. This is what gets us into the initial foundations. Why was the beast created? Repto-Syrian fascism versus the family of man. This now gets into origins. How did we get to where we are today? Well, if you know where things came from, you can understand what's happening now and even see how history is repeating itself once again. And then you know how to avoid it if you learn from it the right way. A long time ago, in a galaxy very far away, to borrow a term, you had this Empire of Orion. They were more so known as the Arian, A-R-I--A-N. From Arian, you get the mispronunciation of Aryan, as in Aryan super race. We know where that came from and where that went. And the other pronunciation, Orion, in the scientific and astronomy community. And it's interesting, from that one word, Arian, you get these two completely different words that are tied at the hip. So they decided, we want to expand the empire. It was based on property, greed, profit, tradable commodities. Let's expand the empire. The reptilian kings started it. They got to a certain point where they became satiated with what they had. They got lazy, but the queens saw what was happening. They got hungry. They wanted to learn how to do it. The kings taught them. So they figured, all right, fine, let them do the work. Well, the queens were hungry, okay? And they got real good at it, to the point where they ended up replacing the kings altogether. And they were known as the Sata queens. And they had their own very highly evolved group within that called the Siakar, who took the art form of psyops to an artistic level in terms of mind influence, brainwashing, okay, suggestive thinking, and getting their way when making deals. They were unrelenting, and they had an aggressiveness that made the kings look like weaklings. They expanded the empire even that much further, and they didn't stop. And the mentality of the kings acting like they were in charge and putting the queens in charge of doing the dirty work, you see this in what involved into the corporate mentality of today, with women as VPs, still, they're still looking through a glass ceiling. Why? Because there's that one white male CEO who's still in control of it all. And he knows he can get a lot more work out of a woman than he'll get out of a male VP. So he'll put them to work with empty promises about breaking the glass ceiling. This is what the kings thought they were getting away with. And little did they realize the queens had other plans and overpowered them. And that's what led to the expansion of the Arian or Orion Empire. By doing that expansion, they end up coming in contact with a somewhat younger but equally powerful empire, the Canis Empire. And from that, they eventually crossed paths with King Anu, which became their favored, how would I say, their favorite puppet. He was a Syrian feudal lord. Now, Canis coincides with the word canine. That's where we get it from. And believe it or not, that's what this race looked like. Bipedal canines, bipedal dogs, okay? Whereas the reptilians looked like bipedal Komodo dragons. The ones who were the elite in charge of, let's say, the Orion Empire and the Canis feudal lords, they had this pinkish pale skin. So all of a sudden you see a theme take place here where the pale skin is superior and anything else that's dark skinned is subordinate. Okay, when you hear these reports and experiences of people coming in contact with these drox or reptilians who are greenish or dark brown, yeah, they're menacing. They seem to be overpowering, but they're taking their marching orders from something else that doesn't exactly have the same skin color. And so they come in contact with each other, which was like oil and water, and they went at it with each other over territory. And it was like the irresistible force meeting the immovable objects. They were beating the ever-loving hell out of each other and taking on liable losses. Well, both of them were of the mind of profiteers, and both of them saw their empires as running a business and realized we can't keep taking these losses on. We're not getting anywhere. Nobody's gaining any ground here. Maybe it would be better to work together with a tentative peace. So the Canis feudal lords and the reptilian queens met, and it was agreed upon that the reptilian queens would be decreeing the orders and the Canis feudal lords would be carrying it out. This is the beginning of your two-party system of upper management and middle management, okay? So the queens became upper management of the Orion Empire and the Canis feudal lords became middle management doing the dirty work. In that tentative peace, it was okay because the Canis feudal lords would have first dibs on getting out there and finding those tradable commodities by colonizing other solar systems as these two empires worked together and expanded exponentially even further. This is what brings our primordial history into it, because they expanded so far that they came out to the backwater end of our Milky Way and found Earth, found our solar system. Okay, and at that point, these Canis feudal lords thought they had found a gold mine. There were dollar signs flying everywhere. Okay, because we have these rich tradable commodities in our solar system across all 9 planets that are not as easy to find anywhere else. So then became the competition. These feudal lords, you know, when it came to profiteering, it's not like they got along with each other too well. One would easily stab the other in the back to get ahead. Well, the one, after all that infighting, the one who came out ahead was the favored one all along, King Anu. And once all the other competition was eliminated and thrown out or killed off, he was given the okay by the queens to move in and take over the solar system and start draining it, strip mining the whole solar system of its valuable commodities. In that, you get the, what comes from that is the storyline of his 2 sons and his 1 daughter, Prince Enlil and Prince Ea and Princess Ninhursag. Now, this is where you start getting into this really bizarre Shakespearean drama about what played out. Prince Enlil was the older son. King Anu wanted him to take over, but Prince Enlil was like, I don't want anything to do with these degenerate primates here on Earth. Why do I have to be here? I hate them. I don't want to be here because you're my oldest son. And if we don't do this and follow the rules, then the queens are going to come down and all of our heads are going to be on a silver platter. So shut the hell up, get down there and do what I tell you. Fine. Begrudgingly, he takes over the operation. He is known as the Lord of the Sky, Sky Lord, which is just a fancy term for Air Force. He was in charge of this, to borrow a term from Star Wars, the Star Destroyers, okay, the battle cruisers, okay, the thing that could wipe the floor up with a planet. And his his elite guard that he brought with him, we know as, we use the term Anunnaki. And they were the royal guard, though. They were not used to doing slave labor. They were brought down with Enlil. They were put to work, draining the mines, drilling, mining. And at a certain point, they're like, we're the royal guard with King Anu. Why are we down here being treated like slave labor? This is a bunch of garbage. Well, there's this philosophy that came out in that relationship between the two empires. You always have to keep the paycheck going to the queens, no matter what. You can't stop that paycheck from going to the queens, okay? You do everything under your power to keep that going, or else. And we'll just leave that open-ended. So when the Anunnaki decided to rebel against Enlil, the older son, who himself was had a very sadistic attitude towards the primates here, the idea came up at that point, look, we need to solve this problem. We got to get that paycheck going to the queen because work came to a dead stop. Nobody's getting anything at this point. That's when the idea came in. King Anu brought his other son into the picture, Prince Ea. He was the master geneticist. So was his sister, Princess Ninhursag. They were both sent down, brother and sister. Okay. They were put in charge of creating a new slave caste. Okay. And that meant using the raw genetic material that was already here. Primate ancestors. Okay. They were hardwired into the biorhythms of this planet, this ecosystem. So they would make the perfect slave because psychologically, they weren't being brought in from another planet, so they wouldn't snap by being in a foreign alien place. So they went to work on trying to create that perfect obedient slave out of the primate model that would be smart enough to know how to push buttons and pull levers, but not be so smart to be self-aware. Going back to Shakespeare, I think, therefore I am. They didn't want that. The decree came down. These slaves cannot be smart enough to be self-aware. They must obey orders to keep the profit turning and keep that paycheck going to the queens. So they go about doing this, several failures, several abortive tests, nothing was working out. They would get it to the point where it would try to take orders, but it just wasn't understanding. And then Prince Ea was getting frustrated. He walks away from the project. Princess Ninhursag keeps going. She figures out the solution. And she calls her brother, brother, come over here. I want to show you something. And before them stood an upright ape. Wasn't crouched down. It was the Adapa, which is where we get the word ape from. Ad Appa, the ape of the mud and clay. Okay. And over time, that's where the mispronunciation ape came from. And symbolically, it means it's very significant to understand how ape came from Adapa, because eventually, in reality, they were being trained to ape the commands they were told to do. You see this dynamic play out in the Planet of the Apes movies, which are very significant to understanding what was happening here. That's part of the Invisible College, the entire Planet of the Apes story arc there. And so then they had something to work with. It could obey commands. It was smart enough to push buttons, pull levers, but it wasn't aware of why it was there. It wasn't aware of its existence. There was no self-awareness at all. Okay. Enlil gets word of this. Great. We got a slave now to do the dirty work. Put him to work. But Enlil's sadistic attitude was like, let's work him to death. he abused them in all sorts of horrific ways in those mines, and they were dropping dead left and right. This was irritating the living hell out of Prince Aya and Princess Ninhursag. I mean, for what it's worth, I mean, I'm not painting them like the good guys, but these were their creations. And seeing their sadistic brother take the reins and drive them into the ground to their early death wasn't sitting well with them. So, but the decree is, you got to keep the paycheck going. You can't disobey the decree. You can't make them smart or self-aware. What are you going to do? Well, Princess Ninhursag kept telling her brother, don't disobey. I know what's on your mind. I know what you're thinking. Don't do it. And Prince Aya was like, screw it. I'm going to do it. He decides to take a certain group of the Adapa and go his own way. So now all of a sudden, he's already breaking every cardinal decree under the sun with the empire. This was not going to sit well later on with his father or the queens. But he decides to take a select group into private caves, unbeknownst to anybody else, and start teaching them about themselves, who they were, where they came from, all this forbidden knowledge. This is where you get the mythological story of the Garden of Eden from. Him taking them into those caves. The Garden of Eden represented, it's a metaphor for taking those original primates into the cave and teaching them forbidden knowledge. The whole idea of eating the forbidden fruit from the tree was just propaganda that was bestowed from Enlil later on. So the problem is that he couldn't get them to learn fast enough because they were genetically created to just obey orders. They weren't retaining anything. And you had to do this on the QT fast before Enlil found out and then get them back to work. So the process had to be speeded up. There had to be something to help them. And Princess Ninhursag whispered in his ear and said, you know, we have this relationship with the Ankhils, and you know what they have. Okay, fine. The Ankhils, and we'll get into that in the slides coming up here. The Ankhils were a race of beings that throughout our mythos, we would interpret as angels. They were avionic, bird-like entities, ultra-terrestrials, if you wish, half in and half out of the third dimension here. And they were perfectly depicted on the screen in the movie The Abyss. If you ever watched that by James Cameron, those entities, that's the Ankhils, plain and simple. They were transparent. You could see through them, but you could touch them, which was representative of saying, well, they were half in and half out of the third dimension. These Ankhils were significant because they were one of those superior races, evolved races, that were in charge of taking care of something extremely important that couldn't be used and abused. It couldn't just be handed out to anybody. And that was the gene for passion, the thing that gives you a sense of self-awareness in the first place. So Princess Ninhursag and Prince Aya had a relationship with them. Why? Because they're master geneticists. So naturally, they would know the Ankhils from the genetic perspective. So he goes to the Ankhils and says, look, I need this. He gets the genetic code from them, takes it back, implements it into this select group of Adapa that he picked out, and all of a sudden that excelled their self-awareness by leaps and bounds. Now they could start retaining information and remember what they were being taught, because now they had that gene for passion, which turns into something very significant later on we'll get into. So he's disseminating their origins to them. He's sharing forbidden knowledge with them about themselves that they're not supposed to know about. But the process was still slow. They were retaining it, but it wasn't going fast enough still. Okay, fine. How are you going to kick that up a notch? Well, mass dissemination to all of them at once was the way to go. So in these caves, the walls were lined with crystalline technology. Basically, march them into the cave, flick the switch, and beam the information right into him that much faster. It speeded up the process. And he had to do that to transfer that information that much quicker. He had a device Nowadays, we call it the Ankh. It was a technological device. In Star Trek, they call it the universal communicator. That's what the Ankh is. And people aren't so far off base when they say, well, the Ankh represents an angel. Not exactly true. The Ankh is the root word of Ankhil, the beings that he got the genetic code for passion from. And the Ankh represents them, the head of a bird, the wings of a bird, the tail of the bird, the Ankhils. But it was a device used, and because of Prince Aya's association with the Ankh, the Adapa that he was training and teaching started referring to him as the Ankh. Over time, Anki or Enki. So this is how he gets his pen name, Enki. By association with the Ankh and the mispronunciation of the word Ankh, which is A-N-K-H. Nowadays, it got truncated down to O-N-K. It's the same thing, but the real spelling is A-N-K-H. This creates a very select group of anointed ones who are now above the Adapa, almost like the beginning of that high priesthood. They became known as the Iesu, the anointed ones, or the Adam. And this is where the Adam comes into play with our mythological storytelling. The Adam was a real thing, but it's not referring to one individual. The Adam is a collective term. Anointed primates that were elevated above the rest because of their forbidden knowledge and their ability to retain it that much faster. They were being taught forbidden history. Iesu is a very significant term used for them because over time, if you look throughout the Middle Eastern and Mesopotamian area, you realize variations of that name trickled down as a popular term. Asa, Isa, okay? Iesu became mispronounced as Jesus, which then became mispronounced as Jesus, okay? That's where that term comes from. And the reason that's significant is that that wasn't even his real name. That was just a mispronunciation of his designation of being the Iesu. His real name was Guru Master Prophet Isa, but even Isa is a variation of Iesu. So it all circles back on itself when you see how the words are all related to each other. And that brings us over to here, expanding the empire, how and why they came. We went over, I covered a lot of this already, explaining the backdrop, but then we